Welcome to this episode of Good Morning Mama. We have a special guest today. This is Dr. Amelia Kelley, and she has written several books, and we're going to talk about some of these today. I'm going to show you them. I have two of them. She has another one.
Hmm.
This one is Gaslighting Recovery for Women, and this one is Powered by ADHD. And she also has another book, probably in her hand right now, that I cannot wait to read that one as well. But she is a wealth of knowledge. She is a therapist and has many years of experience with these topics, and I cannot wait to visit with her. So let's jump right in. Welcome to Good Morning Mama. We're two instant best friends with a combined 13 children, ages newborn to 16, talk about all things motherhood. Our new mom versus seasoned mom dynamic will leave you laughing, and our Christian values and positive outlooks will leave you inspired. So grab your coffee, pull up a chair, and enjoy our visit.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you.
Yes, I'm glad that you're here. So tell us about your journey to become the profession that you've decided to be. I mean, how interesting that must be just to be in your profession. And then what led you to write these books? And just tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I am, if you've heard generational trauma, that term before, I'm kind of the quintessential byproduct of that. So my maternal family were actually refugees from the Ukraine.
Wow.
So this was during the first wave of, obviously not recent, I'm not that young. So I was exposed to, a loving family, but there was always this undercurrent that something deeper was there and there was a deep wound. And so, also being a highly sensitive person and an empath, I absorbed a lot of that. And I think, as many of us are called wounded healers, we go into this field because we want to understand and help and kind of be able to put the puzzle pieces together. So I've been doing this work for 20 years. Actually, 9/11 just occurred. 9/11 was a big motivator for me. I was originally going to become a graphic artist, but then I saw a little documentary about an art therapist working with childhood survivors of the firefighters. And I had like one of those like aha moments, like this is the path.
Amazing.
But early in my career, I started, working with families and at-risk youth, and I really enjoyed it, but something wasn't coming full circle. And then I'd mentioned to you guys about my fertility journey, the traumas that came from that got me so much more interested in how do you treat trauma because it was a huge, huge event in my life and it brought a lot of pain. And so finding ways to treat that, EMDR was like a huge catalyst that got me so excited. And I realized trauma was my true passion. And so trauma led to these books. I was on a podcast that used to exist called High Heels and Heartache with my co-author from What I Wish I Knew. And she has a survivor story from a very violent situation. And at the end of the episode, we were talking about how trauma is stored in your body. I had said, have you ever thought of writing about your experience? And it was like one of those, spiritual aha moments, like, this is it, this is the thing.
Yeah.
And that journey has just continued on and led to continuing to empower survivors. And this is such a huge passion for me.
I bet in helping others through your books and your podcast and just your profession, you've kind of found it was probably healing for yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to be willing to go inward in order to expect others to do the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Absolutely.
excited that the timing of this worked out so perfect that we're talking about this in October, which
Hmm.
is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I
Right.
feel like a lot of people, I mean, everyone has probably heard of domestic violence, but I think there's things that they think that it
Hmm.
is so much more than that. For
Hmm.
instance, they think that it may not happen in, wealthy families, or they think
Hmm.
that it, only happens to certain types of people, or they think that it only happens to women and
Hmm.
or in romantic relationships. And that's not exactly true. That might happen a lot of the time, but it can happen to anyone. And there are warning signs. And I think when I read your book, I thought you did a very good job at highlighting all of those stereotypes and the warning
Hmm.
signs
Hmm.
and breaking down those like preconceptions that people might have about this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about things that people should know in October about domestic violence and about warning signs and just about the term gaslighting in general? Because some people may not even know what that is.
Right, absolutely. I love that you brought up the point that it's misunderstood in the fact that I think classically we thought of violence as physical, and that was the kind of bar that we set. And even in our, honestly, even our laws reflect that. And luckily that's changing slowly. There's some states that are starting to recognize the impact that emotional abuse can have. And some studies have even shown that when you expose the brain to emotional abuse and even to being stonewalled, do you know that term, stonewalling? Right. So
You feel free to elaborate because there might be people that don't
sure.
know what this means.
Yeah, absolutely. So stonewalling is a term that was coined by Gottman, and it has to do with cutting off someone. And it's like the silent treatment to the umpteenth degree, where you are just not even acknowledging that the person exists. And that can have such a negative impact on the brain that they have found that things like stonewalling, the silent treatment, emotional abuse, power of control, all of those things signal the brain the same way that physical pain does.
Oh, wow.
The same areas light up at the same intensity.
Wow.
Yes.
I
And if
believe
you
it.
figure these things are harder to detect, I've even had clients who have used the term at least I wasn't hit.
I've heard
Right.
that from other people too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of like
Right.
my experiences, so I grew up and I had a bit of a traumatic childhood, but I was
Mm-hmm.
also I was raped at 15 and
Mm-hmm.
had some more traumatic
Mm-hmm.
situations when I was in an abusive relationship. And I know
Mm-hmm.
Karla will speak to has spoken to her domestic violence recovery. And I think a lot of that, you're right, we do kind of end up relying on, well, at least I wasn't totally beaten or this, or
Right.
kind of ignore what the gaslighting could have been or the warning signs when we are put in those difficult positions because either we
Mm-hmm.
get used to that emotional feeling or it
Right.
becomes comfortable. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, what really is that? That's just so intriguing to me. And is there a way that we could see it earlier and be able to kind of get out of that situation sooner before we even experience that kind of physical
Right.
as well?
Certainly. I mean, the thing of it is, and I think this is important also to understand because we don't want to blame the victim and we don't want to
Yeah.
say, well, you should have known, because I think what we're understanding, and as you know, Karla, you had said so well that it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter, your wealth, it doesn't matter your background, it doesn't matter how well put together you are, it can happen to anyone. And one of the biggest warning signs that I try to get people to really pay attention to early on, and this is something I address a lot when I'm working with survivors who are worried about getting back into relationships. Don't shy away from setting boundaries as early as possible. I'm talking, and I'll speak about romantic relationships on this one. First date. Like, don't shy away from saying things that are important to you, that matter to you, that define what you need in a relationship. I think too many people think they have to mask early on. And if we mask too much in the beginning of a relationship and we're too agreeable, it doesn't signal to the narcissist or the abuser that you mean business.
Yeah.
And it's okay to say these things very, very early on, because we want to remember people who abuse like this are masters at what they do.
Yeah.
They are so good at manipulating, and they are usually quite charming and usually very difficult to detect, especially if, Chelsea, you had mentioned being abused and raped at, you said 15?
Yeah.
What happens when you experience any form of abuse early on in your formative years is that your nervous system will start to acclimate to stress,
Right.
and it won't send red flags as readily to your nervous system to let you know that you might be encountering danger. And so understanding that you need to kind of get ahead of that
Yeah.
and realize that your nervous system may not signal get away from this person quite as early as maybe someone who had not experienced that sort of horrific event in their past. And that's also not to say that you have to have experienced something like that to then end up in a relationship like that either.
That's interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting. And it's also true. And these abusers, I can speak from experience, but also followers who have messaged me are very good at making up after they abuse.
Mm-hmm.
They will
Mm-hmm.
abuse, and then they'll convince the victim that they're going to change, and they'll remind them of the good parts, and they'll remind them of, or give them false hope. And so the victim stays, and then it'll just continue this cycle, and every time it
Right.
gets worse and worse and worse.
That's
Mm-hmm.
like love bombing, right? That's what
Oh,
that's
it's so
called.
crazy. And then the people looking in from the outside looking in, they don't see it. And so they will tell the woman or the couple that, they're so great together, and
Mm-hmm.
they're so lucky to have someone like that. And then
Right.
the victim's sitting there like, maybe it is me, because no one else sees this except me. And so that's the gaslighting that happens, that, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, maybe they're right. Maybe it is me, because nobody
Mm-hmm.
else sees this or feels this except me. So maybe, and it's just this whole mind game that goes on. And so yeah, it's a very important topic, and you bring up very good points. And there definitely are warning signs, and there are things that women can do, when entering any relationship, to just be on guard for these behaviors. One
Mm-hmm.
thing that I always say, so last year was the first year I started talking about my story on social media, and I'm so glad that I did, because it was
Yeah.
incredibly hard. Even though it's been like close to 20 years, it
Mhm.
was very hard to just talk about that, because I'd prefer to just not go there again.
Yeah.
But in telling my story, I was able to help so many people. But one thing that I said over and over is, when they show their true colors the first time, believe them. Believe them the first
Yes.
time,
That's
'cause,
awesome.
and it is so true, because, had I done that, and had the followers that have told me their stories, I mean, I have hundreds of stories from women. There
Mm-hmm.
were signs at the beginning. And if they believed them the first time,
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't have escalated to the level that it did. And
Right.
it can get extremely dangerous too. I mean, we lost a woman in our community a few months ago.
Oh
um,
no, I'm
Lost her
sorry.
life, and she was a mom, because of domestic violence. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not something where, oh, they say mean words and you feel bad, and or they, or even physical. It can get extremely, extremely dangerous, and people just need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. And I
Mm-hmm.
think from like my experience, and I would love to hear your expert opinion on this. Um, do get stuck in that cycle, right? Where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, maybe it with the gaslighting and then the love bombing, and maybe it is me, especially if you've
Mm-hmm.
been abused at a young age too, and you're kind of used to the volatility where that is really comfortable. At least that was my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I I swear God put my husband in my life, because before that
Mm-hmm.
I was in extremely abusive and volatile situations, because I just truly thought that that's kind of where I belonged. And I think that,
That's all
for
you knew,
me,
probably.
that was, yeah, I
Right.
mean, my parents were great, but from romantic situations, that was all I really knew. And then when I went through the trauma that I did at 15, I mean, it was definitely very difficult. And that cyclical cycle of I just kind of really got used to that. And that's how I thought love was.
Yeah.
Is that's from my therapy sessions, I've learned that that's pretty normal. We have another visitor.
Hi. Special
um,
guest.
a special guest appearance. Can you speak to that at all? Is that a normal experience? And how
Mhm.
do we kind of get out of that? I've prayer
Mhm.
really helped me, therapy, EMDR
Mhm.
really helped me. Those
Mhm.
kinds of things, your books for sure.
Mhm.
But is there something more that we can be doing? I would love to hear your opinion on it.
Both
So,
of you brought up so many, no, that's okay. Both of you brought up so many good points. I want to make sure to unpack a little bit. The two terms, love bombing and gaslighting, I do think it's important for listeners to really understand them.
Yeah.
Gaslighting, it was actually the most popular word searched, I think in 2023. It was like the word of the
yeah.
year. Ironically, probably not ironically, same year my book came out, but um, the thing about gaslighting, it's a behavior that has existed as early as humans have existed. So it's not a new thing, but we finally have a term. And it is any sort of form of emotional manipulation or trying to control or confuse another person, especially in reference to their memory, their perception of reality. And it can look like things like denial, lying, fabricating truths. It can look like, even as I was mentioning, stonewalling, where you ignore someone or even punishing someone for their perception of something. And I want to make sure people understand gaslighting is not just remembering different. We have different memories. We all have different filters that we experience the world, but gaslighting is intended to confuse and throw you off. So that's one thing to really understand. The other, love bombing. So there's two different types of love bombing that I think are important to understand when trying to prevent these kinds of relationships and when trying to get out of these kinds of relationships. And this goes well with what you both were talking about with the cycle of abuse. So love bombing in the beginning is going to be very one-sided. It does feel good. It looks good. It's gestures, it's adoration. So a lot of us try to unpack, how do we decipher that from the excitement of a new relationship? The one thing to really pay attention to with love bombing early on is that it really pushes your boundaries. It doesn't really take into account your comfort level. It happens despite your protesting, oh, you really don't need to go over the top like that. In a loving exchange in the beginning of a relationship, the person wants to really know what you like and your preferences. They're going to take the time and they'll pull back if maybe something feels like too much. Whereas a love bomber will double down. Don't you know, I love you. This is why I'm doing this. That's love bombing. And it also, love bombers don't share as much about themselves early on. They like to collect information. They are there to just learn as much about you as possible. And that can look like someone who's very invested and very interested, but it actually is a precursor for being very controlling. Now, to your point about, both of you were talking about the cycle of abuse. There are 4 common parts of the cycle. The first is the incident. The next is, what you were speaking about as far as with the I'm sorry's and the repair and this won't happen again. And then you're going to have the calm. And this is where we think things have changed. We're on a good point. We're on the upswing. And then it will lead back to tension and then finally incident. So this just happens again and again. And here's the thing. We are designed to feel good in these cycles. Think of this: if someone gambles or does slot machines, every time I'm not a gambler, but I'm just using it as an example. But if you throw the coin in there and you pull the lever and you're like, oh, maybe next time, maybe next time. Once you finally get it, it's so rewarding. The feel-good hormones that get released when you win are so rewarding. You forget about all the money you spent to get there.
Yeah.
It's very similar with the cycle of abuse, where once you get the love, once you get the repair, it can be so rewarding and feel so good. It can feel like the best love you've ever had, and then mask a lot of the incidents or feelings that even led to the repair. And that's why you were asking, what do we do about this? Unfortunately, this cycle can be very addicting. And like any addiction, abstinence is really the best option. And so this looks like, sometimes we've heard the term probably radio silence, where you just have to cut the person off. And with my clients, I remind them, anytime you are exposed to this person, your nervous system, your heart, your mind, your hormones, everything is going to go right back to that cycle.
A good reminder. In my research last year, found that the typical amount of time someone returns to their abuser before they finally leave, I believe it was 4 to 6 times.
I believe it.
Yeah. And personally, I can attest to that.
Yeah. What was it? I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question, but what was it for you that helped you realize the cycle was not helping you, but hurting you? I'm so curious.
Well, and I'll share the link to my story last October. I might even redo it again because it was very impactful last year. But it took me being attacked while I was pregnant to finally leave.
Oh
That's what it took. So the thought of, because before it was just me, or I was like, oh well, it'll get better, and marriage is forever, and I was optimistic, and I gave chance after chance, and then when I unexpectedly became pregnant, and he was very against that. And wanted me to terminate the pregnancy. And I said, I just can't do that. Like, I just can't, even though I know that the child is going to be brought up in this terrible environment. I can't do that.
Yeah.
The farther along the pregnancy got, the more angry he got and the more violent he got. And then I was attacked in the middle of the night when I was 24 weeks pregnant, and I barely made it out of the house. It was a God thing. And then when I went to the police department after that, I said, I'm finally done. Like it was like a light switch at that moment.
Yeah.
It literally was. There was no turning back. It was just like, and I'm 100% done now. Like you tried to hurt my baby, and that's like the mama bear in me showed up. And that was it. That's what it took. So, and that shows you though how the level that it has to get to for women to leave sometimes. And I've heard from many women who have multiple children, and they're in this situation with, several children. And I can't imagine going through that with children. I just cannot imagine the dynamic there. But I also, I believe this is true too, that when a woman finally leaves is when the fear of staying is greater than the fear of leaving. That's what I believe. Because from the outside looking in, people say, just leave. Like they're mean to you. You just leave. It's that simple, but it is not that simple at all.
No, it's not.
And no one understands that until you're in it. But that's when they leave, is when the fear of staying is greater.
Which was really interesting with the cycle that you were, sorry, I was just so intrigued when you were explaining the cycle and how it can become addicting. That makes a lot of sense as to why it takes so long for women to leave those situations. I know from my experience, I was also nervous about being embarrassed or letting my family down also. So I was trying to avoid the abuse also. Did you experience that at all, Karla, where you were kind of embarrassed or you didn't want to talk about being abused?
I didn't tell anybody. My parents didn't know. Nobody knew. And it was partly because I think if I really think back, I thought I could fix it. And I didn't want to make them worried. I didn't want to, have them worry about me. And then I just believed that it would get better. And, I was raised in the church, and I just felt like I was a failure because I was married in my early 20s, and this was not working, and it was not my fairy tale marriage that I thought. And I felt like a failure, and I thought that, I was doing something to cause this. And so when everything happened, and then, I did leave, I realized that I should have done things a lot differently. But in hindsight, now that I do have my fairy tale and I'm on the other side of this and I can help people, I can tell you that life is so much better on the other side of this. Like once you take the hardest step, which is the first step, then no matter what the ending is, it is better than being where you are in that relationship. It's going to be hard. I mean, it's not like you take that first hard step and then it's all sunshine and rainbows. There's a lot of stress. Like there was 4 years of in and out of court and being afraid every day during that time. But then once you are in a different situation, it is it's like you realize you were living in a shell of yourself and that you weren't really yourself. And you realize that, God had a plan the whole time, and that you weren't a failure because, you were in a abusive marriage. And it's not, God still loves you, even though you had to get a divorce because you were being physically attacked, and God has a bigger plan for you, and it's okay. And so, anyway, I appreciate my life and my children and just everything so much more today, having gone through that. I wish this would not happen to anyone, but on the other side of it, it has given me incredible perspective that, like my husband and I literally don't fight about anything. And it's because, say he leaves the clothes on the floor, say he, I don't know, doesn't put the dishes in the sink. Those little things are so little, they're not even worth addressing because of the things that I have experienced. And I'm just so thankful for this life and this healthy home that we have, that I feel like I could have maybe not had I not gotten this healthy second chance. And so I'm just thankful every day for it.
Gosh, that's such a good reminder. Like just even thinking if you're in a healthy relationship, a non-abusive relationship, like the little things.
Yeah. Like I wish people could have this perspective without going through the abusive relationships, because it just makes all the little things right where they need to be. They're not things that need to be big thing.
Karla, you said something that I think is so important though, that about children, that if you don't mind me saying something about getting out when you have kiddos.
I can't
Yeah,
imagine.
please.
So I think one of the big misconceptions is that the addition of children might stop the abuse,
Right.
when in actuality, research shows that especially narcissists and other toxic manipulators, they actually increase their behaviors when children come around. It doesn't mean that they always target the children, but they will at least increase their behavior towards the person they're initially abusing because the children threaten their ego because they don't get all the attention.
Hmm. They probably also
Mm.
feel like the woman is not as likely to leave because there are children and it's harder for them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's
Right.
interesting. So Chelsea and I were talking before
Oh, yeah, yeah.
after we read your books, and we were like, we have got to ask Dr. Kelley, what are there things that cause someone to grow up and be an abuser? Like, are there common things? Like, we think we might know, like maybe they grew up in an abusive home, maybe they grew up
Mm-hmm.
in different types of
It was
homes.
normalized, or
Maybe
yeah,
they
Mm-hmm.
were that child that
if
was
that's
in
how
a
they learned how to communicate,
Mhm.
or they were abused,
Mm-hmm.
Do you
right?
see that? Do you
Mm-hmm.
see common themes in abusers that
Mm-hmm.
are similar about their upbringing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what causes someone to be like this?
Sure. So there are so many different theories on this, and I can share what I've seen and kind of what the science says about this. First and foremost, when we look at narcissism and we look at people who manipulate, generally they don't have high emotional intelligence and they struggle to express or be vulnerable themselves. And so, if they grew up in environments where they were repressed, they were modeled in ways where you don't repair, you just ignore, you sweep things under the rug. So, I think there's a notion that all abusers were brutally abused themselves. And of course, that will make someone more likely to be unhealthy as an adult. But we also want to pay close attention to those who come from families that don't talk about issues.
Mhm.
Right. That's a very big red flag that's not paid enough attention to.
Interesting.
Right. And so if we think about people who are narcissistic, people who are abusive generally struggle with apologies. They struggle with taking ownership. And anything that threatens that, they are going to be more likely to use the gaslighting that we were touching on. And if someone is, however, able to model apologies and repairs. And that's why one of the things I love, a parenting piece that I love to recommend to people, don't hide every conflict you have from your children. And of course, we want to be aware of what kind of conflict.
Right.
For instance, if Karla, if you have a weekday and you do get annoyed about the laundry on the ground, for instance, it's okay for one of your kids to see you feel a little annoyed, bring it to your husband's attention. He apologizes and repairs, and then you amend. You move on. You still love each other. When we show this to children, when they can see that none of us are perfect, we make mistakes. It's okay to own up to our mistakes. And also when we apologize to our children.
Right. That's what I was going to ask. Yeah. Because we talked
Right.
about that in another podcast as well, is ensuring that we apologize to our kids because we mess up
Hmm.
too.
Right. Absolutely. But we also can look at, have either of you heard of the ACE study?
No.
So it's adverse childhood experiences. It was one of the largest studies done on childhood trauma. It was actually an accident. They were first trying to study diabetes and weight issues and whether it was attributed to something that would lead to health issues. But what they've discovered in the ACE study is that ACEs are your adverse childhood experiences, things like being exposed to abuse, being exposed to a parent who was, a substance abuser, having an unstable home financially. These are just a couple of the
Mhm.
examples. The more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have physical health issues in the future. And actually, it can indicate mortality.
Hmm.
Wow.
Interesting.
Right, with the caveat that hopefully, if you know you have high ACEs, you can do things to increase your health and pay attention to your wellness. But I would go so far as to say there's probably a connection between ACEs and the likelihood that someone might become abusive. There's
Mhm.
one other thing. There are some studies showing that there's some genetic differences in the brain of people who are sociopathic or narcissistic.
Because
Wow.
And
you do see a lot of times it
That's
is
so
a cycle
interesting.
and it is generational, and
Mhm.
And
Yes, very
you
much.
wonder, like, what, like, is it generational because of a genetic thing, or is this how their family brings them up? And so that's why they're like that. But you do see these
Hmm.
types of things in families a lot. And I was going to ask you, if someone comes from a family, with abuse or with any
Hmm.
characteristic that they don't want to continue, how do they break that cycle for themselves, but also for their children, if they do have children that unfortunately did see the abuse
Right.
before they left? How do you break that cycle?
I love this question because it's what drives my passion. It's things like what you're doing, education, ownership, prayer, therapy. What if someone is willing to do the work? I mean, I've been pretty open in podcasts before that my husband came from a pretty traumatic experience in childhood himself. And if he wasn't willing to go to therapy, to do the work, to take ownership, to want to change, the cycle would continue, but he's decided to stop the cycle. And so I think it's willingness to own up to the fact that you were impacted and a want and a willingness to change. Because you said something earlier, Karla, about you find this beautiful purpose that has come from what you experienced.
I do.
That's trauma integration. That's like the ability to find a reason or a way that you have evolved that has come from all the pain.
Mhm.
And that's where trauma cycles can end. And that's where this generational trauma can finally be put to rest.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hmm.
That's cool.
Because I hear
Hmm.
from a lot of women too that, and that's one cool thing about being an influencer or a content creator is, you think that, this is just your story or something you're going through, but you get the privilege of hearing from women all over the
Right.
world. And
Hmm.
you're definitely not alone in this, but
Hmm.
you could almost do research on it because you hear so many things. And a common denominator is there's a lot of women who want to break the cycle. Like they see
Hmm.
it and they hate it and they want to do better. And they're
Hmm.
like, how do I do that? Like they
Right.
can't stop reliving it, or it's kind of a PTSD type thing. I guess that would
Hmm.
be the correct term, but they
Hmm.
they just they keep reliving it, and they can't get past it to move forward.
Hmm. I
Yeah.
do think one thing that we should mention too is men, however, that women are going to be more likely to be abused physically. Statistics show that men are equally abused emotionally.
That's interesting.
And
And I've heard
so,
from
So like
several.
mommy issues. I'm sorry. No, but I mean, I am, we were talking about that when we were
Yeah.
trying to figure out, okay, why does an abuser become an abuser? And does it
Mhm,
have to do with certain frustrations with the way that they were maybe guilt tripped or even
mhm,
gaslit by their own mom or
mhm,
parents in general?
mhm,
Is that kind of where a lot of
The
the
aces.
emotional
I bet
abuse,
it is one of
yeah,
those.
mhm.
comes through
Right.
for men?
Mhm,
I'm
mhm.
interested to hear that.
Well, if you think about the fact that if they are, like you said, let's say they were brought up in an emotionally deprecating home, or their feelings weren't accounted for, or they were belittled, or, we didn't bring up high sensitivity and empaths. Think about men who culturally are not encouraged to be sensitive, yet they are sensitive. And maybe they are bullied or belittled or made the kind of outsider in their family because of their sensitivity. They then end up with, I'm just hypothetically saying, a dominating personality who bullies them similarly to how they experienced when they
Yeah.
were a child.
Mhm.
And so they are more likely to continue putting up with that cycle.
Because it's comfortable.
That's all
It's
they know.
and comfortable. I think it's good to kind of use the term, it feels safe.
Okay. Yep.
I think safe is a good way to put it because what we sense as safety can feel different than comfortable. I mean, like, I'm comfortable in my hot tub.
Yeah.
Like,
No, that's
I'm
a really good
comfortable.
point. Yeah, yeah.
But safe is your body doesn't signal there's something wrong,
Okay. Yeah,
right?
that
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Hmm.
That is good. And I have heard from not necessarily the men themselves, but usually it's the mothers who message me and tell me stories of their sons who
Mm.
are in emotionally abusive relationships. And it's things you would never, ever think
Mm-hmm.
that happen. And it's like, what kind of woman would do that? But it's
Mm-hmm.
they may not even want to do it, but that's all they know too. And it just
Mm-hmm.
snowballs and becomes this
Mm-hmm.
thing. One woman referred me to a documentary she said this was pretty much exactly what happened to her son. And the woman was like giving her husband just a tiny bit of food every day and punishing him with food if he
Mm,
did or didn't do certain things. And he was so embarrassed because he was the man. And he was
mm,
like, I can't speak out about this. And she was physically hurting him and like tying him
yeah.
to like putting
Wow.
him in a room. And I mean, it was crazy stuff. And but he felt like he couldn't speak out because he was a man and the stereotype of that. But
Right.
once he did, and once it came to light, it was just, I was so sad for the mom to know that her son was going through that. And
You
then
know,
in hindsight,
it's
there were
really
warning signs, she said, that she missed. And she was
Mhm.
like, gosh, like if I just would have known the warning signs, there were so
Yeah.
like isolating yourself from your
Hmm.
family,
Hmm.
going above and beyond to justify the other person's
Right.
actions, like making so many excuses, like above and beyond what you need to for that person.
Hmm.
Trying to think of some other um, warning signs in those types of situations that the moms or the family members said they missed.
Well, I
But
guess as a mom of new babies, but I read in my parenting new parent journey, right? I read
Hmm.
It Didn't Start With You, The Whole Brain Child, kind of trying to
Hmm.
understand, the child of immature emotionally immature parents. I was trying to
Hmm.
understand the generational kind of breakdown of
Hmm.
making sure that I don't repeat certain cycles because I don't want my kids to have to unlearn certain things that
Right.
I had to unlearn. I want my kids to have a leg up with emotional intelligence and
Hmm.
throughout and how to process appropriately. So I guess what are some warning signs that we can look at as like
Hmm.
parents when it comes to children finding friends?
Hmm.
What are some good like warning signs that we look at? Middle school is known to be really difficult, but what should we
Hmm.
be looking at in certain characteristics? Because we can't control the way that those children's parents are. I mean,
Hmm.
what do we look for in that? It might
Hmm.
not be dating for the kids, but just to protect them. Is there
Right.
things we can?
So would you like to know like the warning signs for just relationships in general or for young children creating relationships?
I think relationships in general would
Yeah.
be good. And I also know that statistically, um, a lot of abuse happens in the early 20s. Like
Hmm.
that is
Hmm.
when a lot of this starts. And so
Hmm.
what would you tell moms that warning signs would be if their children were in the late teens to early 20s and they're in a
Okay.
relationship? What are some warning signs to watch for?
So you had mentioned, I think it was Chelsea had mentioned isolation. I think Karla, you had mentioned it too. That's one of the things that I really encourage people to look out for. If you see a dramatic change in behavior from your loved one or your child, especially let's be honest, the beginning of a relationship, we all just want to spend 24/7 with our person, and you might notice you spend less time with them. But if they don't want to integrate their new partner into your family, that's usually a red flag as well. Like if you notice them keeping you separate, keeping these lives separate, if you're not hearing, if usually your child is someone who shares a lot with you, and then suddenly you're noticing they're withholding information about the relationship, good and bad, that's usually a warning sign as well. Another thing is if the person that you've known and you've loved suddenly stops doing the things they care about. So abusers are going to be threatened by anything that is more important than them. And so I know, like in What I Wish I Knew, my book with Kendall Ann and Karla, I can't wait for you to read it because I feel like you and Kendall Ann remind me of each other a lot. And her experience, I mean, completely different, I'm sure, but there was just some commonalities, kind of how you healed too. Um, but one of the things with her is that she really loved, I think it was like some sort of dance class or something. And he would give her a hard time, guilting her for why would you want to go out and go to this dance class when you could be spending time with me? So if the child, your adult child or your teen, if you notice them pulling away from things that they love and they don't really have a good reason, but they're spending more time with this partner. Another thing, I mean, this is obvious, but if you feel like your child is covering up for things, especially if there's something as blatant as, I don't want to sound kind of cliche, but an injury or some unexplained issue that there really is no reason behind, pay attention. Listen to your gut. I think that's a very important thing is that we need to be really in tune with our intuition as parents and listen in to what your questions are. And if you're not getting answers, I would encourage you to invite your child to talk to you about it. Karla, you brought up such a good point earlier about, not wanting to share what was going on because you didn't want to worry anyone, or you felt like something like you had some blame to be, had in the situation. We don't want to make someone experiencing this, whether it be our child or a friend or a loved one, feel like we're going to judge them
Right.
or feel like we're going to pressure them. That's a really tricky thing here, is that the person in the relationship has to want to leave the relationship.
That's a good point. I've said
Mm-hmm.
that in my post last October. I said, if a friend confides in you that they are in an abusive situation, don't tell them to leave. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, there might be some situations where they didn't leave and there was a happy ending. So there is that small percentage where yes,
Mm-hmm.
this could be, a happy ending. But if you tell that person, here's what you need to do, you need to leave,
Mm-hmm.
that might actually push them away. You can tell them
Yes.
that you are here for them when they are ready to leave, and that you are a safe place for them to talk. You are here for them,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not going to tell them what they should do. They know in their heart what they need to
Yes.
do.
I
Yeah,
love that. And even honestly, with my clients who come to me, some of them in the throes of a relationship like that, I ask them very plainly in the first session, am I helping you stay or am I helping you leave?
they know what they want to do and what they need
Oh,
to do.
wow.
Yes.
I love
Yes.
that.
And if
They
I'm
have
helping
to.
them stay, it's usually because we're gonna, maybe there's children involved or there's something bigger that they can't get out right now, finances, whatever it is. We try to figure out how to fortify them as much as possible, gain their independence even if they're in it, stay safe even if they're in it. The ideal is that they can leave, but sometimes it's not an option.
And they can't fix that person. That person has to want to
Yes.
change. And it has to
Mm-hmm.
probably be a big event to make them want to change and actually make change. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think, I'm not a doctor, but the
Mm-hmm.
older someone is, the more how they're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's harder for them to change. And those are learned behaviors that they're going to have to want to unlearn and to find healthy ways to deal with
Mm-hmm.
relationship stress. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I would think that if someone's in an abusive relationship and it is something they want to save and they want to um, stay together, that it's going to need to involve the abusive person wanting to change more than it is going to be the victim.
It has to. And if they are not taking responsibility or blaming you, I think one of the worst blame cycles can be, well, I did this because you.
Yeah.
That is one of the worst, most overused statements by a gaslighting abuser. It is not because you. Nothing that you do should ever warrant being hurt or manipulated or abused. And I think understanding that there's different forms of abuse. In my book, What I Wish I Knew, I have it, but you can look up the Duluth model of the power of control wheel. Have you heard of this before? It's got slices, it's like a pie, and it shows the different types of power of control that an abuser can utilize. And it can be things like money, socialization, isolation. It can be physical, it can be sexual. There's all these different forms of abuse that we don't always understand are abuse. And here's the tricky thing. If you're in a relationship and even one of those pieces of the pie applies to your relationship, it's potentially abusive. So I
Wow.
would definitely encourage your listeners, look this model up. And it's widely utilized in the clinical world, and it's really important. It can save your life.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'll put that in the description.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Good. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that is very interesting. And a good point is that there are so many forms of abuse. And in talking about domestic violence, like you
Hmm.
said, people think, oh, well, that's hitting. Well,
Hmm.
it is, but there's a lot more different types
Hmm.
of abuse.
Hmm.
Sometimes there's just one, sometimes it's all of them, sometimes it
Hmm.
can be a few of them, but it's all abuse and it's all not okay.
Right. If you feel like someone's taking your power of control away, that's a huge red flag. And that's, if again, getting back to your initial question, if your child who used to have, financial independence suddenly doesn't have a say so over what they do with their money, things like this, that's financial abuse. And that's a form of power of control.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
couldn't imagine. Like, I'm not glad that I did not tell my mom when I was going through this, but as a mom now, I could not
Mm,
imagine knowing that like if my child confided in me and told me that they were
yeah.
in a relationship like that, and for me to have the strength to not say, will come back home and live with us and leave him and all that. But to just say, we're here when you're ready to leave, that would take so much strength from
Yes.
mom to say that. And just the knowing, I've had followers message me too, and they know that their daughter is in an abusive relationship. They know it, and they know that their grandkids are, and they have
Mm-hmm.
to go to bed every night knowing that. And I just could not imagine that from a
Yeah.
mom.
No.
I think saying something as simply as "Thank you for telling me. What can I do to help?"
That's amazing. And it's so simple and profound, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That is, yeah. And they probably won't know because they don't know how to make decisions. They're so in survival mode. That is one thing. If I really think back to those days, you're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the next 5 or 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
or like how to how someone can help you. Like you literally are trying to get through the next hour. Like you don't know.
Yes.
And
You,
it's a weird mindset.
You bring up such a good point about when you're in the middle of these crises, is that you can literally become so pigeonholed on something that, like Kendall Ann had talked about in What I Wish I Knew, that she had a raging case of strep throat and she was so disconnected from her body that she didn't even know. And she went into the doctor and the doctor was stunned. Like, how could you not know you were this sick? And her brain was so zeroed in on surviving that she didn't even know she was violently ill. And
Wow.
so if you think about it, it kind of reminds me sometimes of if you have like a toddler in a tantrum, that's not the moment to do the teaching. Like
Yeah.
you're just there
Yeah.
to help them self-regulate and feel safe. And then when they feel regulated and safe, know that they'll be able to make those choices. But I think that's why it's important to know if you don't know what to do, but you feel unsafe, if anyone is willing to help you remove yourself even temporarily from the situation, hopefully you'll gain some clarity that there is no way you'll gain within it. And
Right.
you both said something also that I think is important to remember. If the abuser wants to change, I will say that it is more likely that people will change outside of the abusive relationship than they will within it.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
Because if we think about our attachment cycles really impact each other. So if you're with an insecurely attached person, and you two together create this kind of trauma bond,
Mhm.
but they want to make the change, but it keeps happening. They keep not being able to make the change. You keep getting hurt. There is a chance that this person will change outside of the relationship. That is not a sign, however, that you are supposed to get back together with them.
Mm.
That's
Mm.
good.
Mhm. That's
Something to
really good.
remember.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
That is good. And when someone is in a abusive relationship, whatever type, they are trying to stay a few steps of that person to try to prevent the next freak out. And so they're always living just a few steps ahead to try to prevent, when really that's so silly because it has nothing to do with you, and anything and everything will create that instability. But I will say, in telling my story last year and even now, that I love giving people hope that are in those situations. And
Hmm.
there are so many women who have been in these situations that are not in them anymore. And they can tell you, and I can tell you, that life is so amazing and wonderful. And this is not forever. Like
Hmm.
you don't have to live like
Hmm.
this forever. And, that relationship doesn't have to define you and be the end of your story. And I'm never saying that the answer is always to leave. And I don't want anyone to think that, because there are situations where
Of course.
this isn't the only solution. But I can say that in my situation, that I 100% believe this was the only way. And that life today, with me marrying my husband, and now we're about to have our 10th baby, and just the
Mhm.
life that we live, um, is something, that happiness level is something that anyone who has been in a abusive relationship can achieve. um, it's really true. They can.
Mhm.
This is not the end of your story.
Yes. If you feel like you have to be 10 steps ahead, it's going to cause so much that hypervigilance, that feeling of having to be on eggshells. And that's what causes the PTSD that you were talking about and complex trauma. If someone makes you feel like you have to be 10 steps ahead, that's a red flag to run from as well. And I would recommend your listeners sit down, meditate on, pray on, and think about what are your red flags? Like, what are the things that are your non-negotiables? And even if you're in this kind of relationship, it's okay to imagine that. If you're out of the relationship, it's a phenomenal thing to come up with ahead of time and pay close attention if that person presents with those red flags. And maybe even have a bestie like you guys are, or, someone that you care about, a therapist who you can say, hey, I met a new person.
Yeah.
Can I run this person by you? Here's the red flags that I normally look for. They don't signal any, or they signal this one. Have someone that you care about to bounce that off of in the beginning can be really powerful as you try to trust again in future relationships.
I think that's
Absolutely.
amazing advice for sure, because I remember I did not follow those rules at all, but thankfully it ended up very good. But I remember hearing that after you leave an abusive relationship, you really shouldn't jump into another relationship for at least a year,
Yeah.
because you will have a tendency to go right back into the same type, and
Mhm.
you're not thinking clearly. I mean, there's many very good reasons for that. We waited not very long at all, but it turned out. But there were zero red flags. It was like night and day.
Mhm.
And I wish that that happened to more women.
Mm.
But that is so smart to have a friend, have someone that you trust, to
Mhm.
say, can you walk through this with me? And I'm going to
Mhm.
confide in you. I'm not going to hide things from you in this next
Yes.
relationship. And you, I would love your honest opinion, and just have a
Mhm.
friend like that, or a family member. Um,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
that's amazing advice, because that's something that I definitely did not do
Mm.
during my time with the abusive relationship. I didn't confide in anybody, tell them anything.
Mm.
So, in addition to your books, because we will be linking those, do you have
Mhm.
other resources, or how can our listeners get in contact with you?
Mhm.
They have ways to get in contact with
Yeah.
us. Of course, we'd love for them to DM us, and we help where we can, but we'd love for them to be able to contact you as well.
Yeah.
Sure. So I am also active on Instagram. So Dr. Amelia Kelley, and I always joke it's Kelly with an EY. It's always misspelled. Thank my husband for that. Um, my website is also, as you mentioned, ameliakelly.com, but I try to make it very well resourced. I actually provide all the most important resources from all my books for free as clickable PDFs on there. So, like the
I
suicide
love
safety
that.
plan, the safety plan from this that helps you get out safely. We didn't even touch on safety plans. Please do not leave
Yeah.
without a safety plan in place. And please know that you can have a police escort if you need, for free anytime you need, to go get your belongings. Do not try to get out by yourself, because
Wow.
that is normally the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. Um, but on there also, I have a link to, I'm on Insight Timer. I have some meditations on there. And today, well, I guess it would have been weeks ago, my Powered by ADHD group is starting. It's going to be every other Thursday virtually. So people from all over the country can join, really anywhere.
Oh, that's
Because
awesome.
I know, because my readers reach
We'll have
out
to
and
have
they,
you on again to talk more about that topic, because we
Yeah,
have so many
totally.
questions on that too.
yes, I would love to. I know, because it breaks my heart when I get requests for therapy like across the country. And as therapists, we're not allowed to serve over state lines because of our licensure.
Oh,
So this,
really?
yeah, so unless you're dual licensed. So this group allows me to, be connected with readers. And then, as I think you mentioned, I have a podcast. It is the Sensitivity Doctors, and I would love to have you ladies on there
Love
sometime. Yeah.
it.
So yeah,
Can
feel
we
free to
take
stay in
five,
touch.
or are you, please continue if there's more ways for people to reach you. Tell me if you're done, or are there more ways?
Those are
I
the
didn't want to
best
interrupt.
ways. Those are the
Okay.
best ways. I mean, you can go through my private practice website and all that, but those are probably the easiest ways.
Okay. And we're going to link those in the description as well. But can we take 5 minutes, and I'm going to let you have the stage and talk about what you just said, the checklist and the most dangerous time right after you get out, because that is super important information, and it's
Yes.
so, like, just pertinent to this talk.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as I was mentioning, the most dangerous time is when you're trying to leave. And I think there's a notion that because you finally have flipped the light switch, as you said earlier, Karla, it doesn't mean that leaving is going to happen safely. And so I really encourage everyone to get a support person. And if you don't feel comfortable coming to your friends and family because maybe you haven't talked to them about it and you're feeling complex feelings about that, as I mentioned, you can literally call your local law enforcement and ask them to do a police escort for you. So they will just simply park outside. They're not going to come in if you don't want them to. And they're just there as a backup and a support. If you need them to enter the premise with you, they will. And they will do this as many times as you need. So just know that it doesn't have to be
You
a one and
recommend
done
getting a
situation.
restraining order?
And I'm sorry, what was that?
A restraining order. Do you recommend getting one?
If absolutely, I do want to be honest about restraining orders though. They're not low stress situations. I mean, there are a lot of, as you mentioned, court can be very stressful. The nice thing though, I will say, this is kind of a post-COVID world, is that some areas do allow you to do some of these proceedings virtually now, which is really nice because
It is nice.
you're not having to be in the same space as your abuser.
Yeah, that's a really scary time.
It is. It is. And it's okay to ask for. I've gone with some of my clients to get their DVPOs, the domestic violence protection orders, with them. So you can have a support person with you, even if it's a professional or if it's a loved one. But the thing about the safety plan, not only identifying a person, there's kind of like the top 5 tips that I try to make sure people realize about leaving. First of all is the police escort. Second of all is making sure, if you're even contemplating leaving, to have a go bag ready.
Mm.
So a little bag, something, that's not something conspicuous that you can put the most crucial items. If you have things like money, ID, social security card, medical card, things like that. Now I know not every situation allows you to pull these out of your, things because your abuser might notice. It can be helpful even to just make photocopies of these things. Also having, change of clothes, a little bit of your medication, almost like kind of like what you would pack to go have a baby. If you think about it,
I was
like,
honestly thinking we're coming off the cusp of a 4th trimester. I was like, oh, like a hospital bag.
but don't do what I do. What was that?
I thought far enough in advance, actually getting away from living day to day, that I actually had that, and I hid mine in my vehicle where the spare tire
Smart.
was. That's where I hid it.
Oh, wow.
That is so smart. Yes, because you don't always know a good place to put it.
Because it wasn't unusual for me in my situation to be locked out of my house, and I had
Oh my
to
gosh.
go to work. And so I would often have to get ready in my vehicle. So I had some like work clothes, makeup.
Yeah.
I know, right? Like, I don't even know who that girl was, but she was strong, like way stronger than I am today.
Yes.
But she did that. Like, she got ready for work in her vehicle because she was locked out of her house.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I'm so sorry.
but yes, that bag that you're talking about is very important. You are correct.
Mhm. Yes, the go bag is crucial. Another thing to remember, which you had highlighted earlier, Karla, is that it's common to leave more than once. So please don't be hard on yourself if you've tried and it didn't work out, or you had the plan and you didn't follow through. There's still time. You can still do it. Another thing is pets. I think some
Mm.
people struggle to leave because of their beloved pets.
Mm.
I know Kendall Ann's dog actually saved her life.
Mine
So
did
when,
too.
oh my God, you have to read the book.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
wow.
feel I feel
My
like
dog,
you're like,
the only time my dog was ever aggressive was that night. And the reason I got out was because of that dog.
No way.
that is exactly
That's
what
so
happened to Kendall
cool.
Ann. That is
Wow.
exactly what happened to her.
Yeah. That's
That is
funny.
wild.
That's not
That is
funny.
wild.
It's just, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so they are so important. And so in your area, I would encourage folks, and this is something, if you are looking for these resources in your area and you can't find them, you can message me and I will help you.
Love that.
But yes, but so in your area, there are normally going to be agencies that will help with placing animals temporarily while you try to find housing, if you cannot find housing or somewhere to bring your pet at first. So please don't, allow this beloved pet to be the reason you don't leave. It can feel
Absolutely.
as intense as children too.
Mm-hmm.
My abuse happened in the state of Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
And in Missouri, they have a program called Safe at Home. And it is a beautiful, amazing program that I did not know about until after I went through this. And somebody from court, right after court, after I got a restraining order, came up to me and said, "Hey, I want you to know about this program." And they handed me a packet. And basically, what it meant is that on your driver's license, on any tax documents, on anything at all that you need to
Mm-hmm.
list your physical address, you use a PO box that actually goes through Jefferson City, and then they will send you
Oh,
your mail. So it does delay your mail a few
wow.
days, but the
Mm-hmm.
abuser cannot find your physical location if you move, because
Wow.
but you have to be strict with it. Like, every single
Mm-hmm.
time you use your physical address, you don't do it. You use your PO box that goes to Jefferson City, and then they will send your things to your home.
Wow.
That way, it's
Yeah.
another layer of protection that keeps you
Mhm.
physically safe. And I think that
Mhm.
that definitely protected me for several years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And also you had mentioned with restraining orders, make sure that if you work somewhere publicly, that your place of employment, and maybe go to HR, someone you feel comfortable, make sure they know about your restraining order.
Yes.
Make sure the school of your children know about the restraining order. Like,
Yeah.
this is a public document that should and can be used more effectively the more people that are brought in the loop.
Yes,
Mhm.
100%. That
Mhm.
is really good information. And I'm glad that we included that.
Yeah,
Yes, for sure.
absolutely.
Hmm.
All right. Is there anything else that we want to talk about before we end this amazing podcast full of information?
Yeah.
I think just, reiterating that there's so much to digest with this. And if you're in the midst of this kind of situation, it's normal and natural to feel completely overwhelmed. And that's why, little by little, having someone that is non-judgmental, who will support you, and, reaching out, I think any of us here would be happy to support someone,
Absolutely.
to just know that it is brave and it is courageous to leave. It is not a sign of weakness. It is not a
Right.
sign of failing. It
Mm-hmm.
is not a sign of anything to feel shame over. If anything, survivors that leave are just like superheroes. They
Yeah.
really are. And I just commend every single one of them who's contemplating, who has done it, or who has helped someone else do it.
Yes, 100%.
I can't say it any better than that.
Thank you for being on our podcast. I know I learned some information, and I hope that our viewers find this helpful as well, whether they know somebody that has been in or that is in a situation like this, or if they've been in a situation or currently are. I hope that this helps you, and I think that it will. So, all right, thank you,
Absolutely.
Dr. Kelly,
Thank
and
you
Yes.
hope
so
you enjoy this
much.
episode of Good Morning Mama.
Yeah. Oh,
Bye.
thank you, ladies.